The Appalachian Mountains have always carried a strange kind of silence, one that feels too heavy, too aware. It's the kind of quiet that holds secrets beneath the fog and in the creak of every old wooden porch. Long before city lights reached these valleys, small towns tucked between the ridges lived by their own rules. Families built their lives on faith, superstition, and loyalty, and those who broke that balance often found themselves cursed by something deeper than law. The hills remember everything: the prayers, the sins, and the screams that never made it past the trees. It was in these hollers and forgotten towns that 10 families would come to shape what locals still whisper about when the night turns still. Families whose names are now spoken with both pity and disgust. But before evil ever revealed itself, their lives looked like anyone else. They had farms, they went to church on Sundays, they raised their children and shared harvest dinners. From the outside, it was ordinary. But inside those homes, the walls had already begun to rot long before anyone noticed. In one valley, an old farmhouse stood surrounded by dying cornfields. The air smelled faintly of mildew and smoke. Behind its peeling paint lived a man who was respected, even feared, a man whose word carried more weight than law. His children rarely spoke in public, and his wife's smile never reached her eyes. People said it was just the mountain way to keep family business inside the family. But anyone who looked closer would have seen the tension in the way the curtains stayed shut during the day, and the way screams were swallowed by the wind at night. Up in another hollow, a small mining town clung to life after the mine closed. Men wandered the streets looking for work while their wives prayed over kitchen tables. Among them lived a family that seemed too perfect: good clothes, polished manners, polite greetings. Yet they had something others didn't: power. Power that came from old money and older fear. People owed them favors, and debts in the Appalachians rarely ended with a handshake. Behind the polished doors of their mansion, something cold grew. A kind of madness passed down like heirlooms, where cruelty became tradition and control felt like love. There was a church on a hill that looked over another town, a wooden structure so old it leaned slightly to one side. Every Sunday, families gathered there, the sound of hymns echoing into the mist. Among the faithful were people who hid their sins behind clean clothes and soft prayers. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, but there were nights when his voice turned from holy to haunting. People said his family was blessed, that God spoke to them directly, but blessings can twist into something unholy when mixed with pride. His children learned to smile through the fear, their lives a performance for a congregation that never saw the truth behind closed doors. Further down the range, deep in the backwoods where the road turned to dirt, there was a cabin that barely stood upright. Inside, a mother raised her sons with the kind of devotion that turned dangerous. She told them the world outside wanted to hurt them, that only she could protect them. Love became possession, and protection turned into control. When the boys grew older, her words lingered, and her fear became their violence. People in town would later say they always knew something wasn't right. But in Appalachia, suspicion rarely turned into action. Across these mountains, the families all shared something: a hunger for control, a belief that they were above consequence, and a silence that kept their secrets buried. They smiled at neighbors, attended local fairs, and hosted dinners where tension crackled beneath every word. Yet behind their front doors, darker truths waited. Some had wealth and used it to buy obedience. Others had only faith and used it to justify cruelty. Each home became its own small kingdom of fear, and those who lived within them learned early that power was both a weapon and a curse. At first, the signs of what was coming were small. Animals are found dead in odd patterns, fires that started without cause. Strange disappearances are blamed on the wilderness. People whispered, but no one dared accuse. The Appalachians teach their people early: speak too loudly about evil and it might hear you. So they stayed quiet, even when the land itself seemed to reject what was happening. In every story that would soon unfold, there was a moment, a choice where everything could have changed. But pride, fear, or blind love always led them further into darkness. These weren't monsters born from legend or folklore. They were families built on faith and tradition, torn apart by secrets they refused to face. Some sought power, some revenge, and some believed they were serving something divine. But all of them shared one truth: once evil took root in their homes, it didn't leave. It spread slow and quiet, like the fog that rolls through the valleys, covering everything until no one could see the difference between good and wicked anymore. The crimes that would come to define these families didn't happen in the city's glare or under flashing lights. They happened in the shadows of the mountains, under the cover of kinship and loyalty. People would remember them not just for what they did, but for how normal they once seemed. Because that's the part that haunts most, the idea that evil doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it grows in silence, behind closed doors, in families that once looked just like everyone else. The first cracks began to show in the smallest ways. In one valley, the eldest son of a powerful family started to question his father's authority. He had grown tired of watching his father make neighbors bow with fear, tired of pretending that respect and control were the same thing. But in that household, questioning meant betrayal. Every dinner turned into a quiet battlefield, words chosen like weapons, silence used like punishment. The father, with his slow-burning temper, began to see his son as a threat rather than kin. The air in that house grew heavy, filled with tension so sharp that even the younger children whispered more softly, as if afraid their voices could spark violence. The father's hand began to shake when he drank, not from weakness, but from the effort of holding his rage inside. Up in the mining town, the family that once held power began to feel their grip slipping. Their money was running out, and with it, their influence. Their patriarch, who had built his life on manipulation and charm, now found doors closing that once opened for him easily. His wife, always immaculate and composed, started to unravel in private, whispering to herself late at night, packing the floors while her reflection in the dark window watched her with pity. Their eldest daughter, born into privilege, discovered that wealth didn't protect her from loneliness. She sought affection where she shouldn't have, falling for a boy from the other side of the valley. It was innocent at first, but when her father found out, everything changed. He forbade her from seeing him again, locking her in the house for days. Love turned to defiance, and defiance turned to obsession. The boy didn't give up, and she didn't stop trying. Soon, the family's perfect image began to rot from the inside out. In the church town, the preacher's sermons became darker. His voice that once brought comfort now carried an edge, his words sharper, his eyes harder. He preached more about sin than salvation, about punishment rather than mercy. His congregation started to sense something off, but fear and loyalty kept them silent. At home, his wife's prayers grew desperate. She had once been his equal, his calm, but now she was just another listener in his shadow. Their children began to flinch at the sound of his boots on the porch, knowing that behind his smile was a man consumed by guilt and pride. There were whispers that he had been seen late at night, walking to the old graveyard behind the church, muttering under his breath as if bargaining with something that was God. In the cabin deep in the woods, the mother's love had turned to something darker, a kind of hunger to keep her sons close, no matter what it cost. The youngest began to show signs of wanting freedom. He talked about leaving, about finding work in town. That's when she started reminding him of everything she had done for him, every sacrifice she'd made. Her voice trembled between affection and threat. When one of the boys tried to go, she followed him into the woods at night, her bare feet silent on the dirt. By morning, he returned, pale, quiet, and changed. The neighbors said he looked like he'd seen a ghost, but his mother's hands were clean, her face calm. After that, none of the boys ever talked about leaving again. Across the mountains, a pattern began to take shape, families twisting under pressure, secrets pressing against the surface like something trapped beneath glass. Financial ruin crept through one home like mold, while another hid an affair that threatened to expose everything. One woman found a letter her husband had been hiding, proof of debts and lies. Another man discovered his wife had been meeting someone she claimed to despise. But rather than confront each other, they let the silence fester. In these towns, pride meant more than peace, and appearances mattered more than truth. So they smiled in public, lied at dinner, and prayed no one noticed how fast everything was falling apart. The mountains themselves seemed to turn against them. Crops failed, storms rolled in without warning, and livestock died without reason. People said it was bad luck, but others whispered it was something else, that the land was tired of burying sins. Rumors spread like wildfire. A child seen wandering in the woods talking to no one, a woman who woke with bruises she couldn't explain, a man who dreamed of his own death night after night. Fear tightened its grip, and suspicion followed. One night in the mining town, a fire broke out in an old barn owned by the wealthy family. The flames reached high enough to paint the sky orange, and though no one was hurt, everyone could feel it wasn't an accident. Some said they saw the daughter running through the field, her white dress catching the firelight. Her father denied it, but the whispers grew. The boy she loved disappeared not long after, his body never found. That fire marked the beginning of the family's fall, and her slow descent into something unrecognizable. In the preacher's home, his wife found a journal hidden beneath the floorboards of his study. It wasn't filled with prayers, but with confessions of things he claimed God had told him to do, of visions that demanded blood. She burned the pages, terrified of what he might do if he knew she had seen them. But once you burn truth, the ashes don't stay quiet. She began to see things, shadows that followed her reflection, whispers that called her name when she prayed. And though she tried to hold her family together, the preacher's mind was already slipping away, convinced he was chosen for something terrible. In the farmhouse where silence had always ruled, the father finally snapped. His son had begun sneaking out at night, helping neighbors without permission, giving away food that wasn't his to give. When the father found out, the beating lasted longer than usual. The mother tried to stop it, and for the first time, the father turned on her too. The house that had once stood like a monument to power became a prison of screams. The next morning, the father stood outside staring at the hills, blood on his knuckles and shame buried deep behind his eyes. But instead of guilt, he felt something else, a strange calm, like violence had finally given him peace. By now, each family had begun to isolate itself. They stopped attending church, stopped visiting neighbors, and stopped talking to anyone but their own. The mountain paths grew over with weeds, and people started avoiding certain hollers after dark. The laughter that once filled the valleys vanished, replaced by the uneasy sound of wind through broken fences. The sons of the mother in the woods began hunting at night, claiming they were catching food, but they often came back empty-handed, their faces dirty, their eyes wild. The preacher's sermons turned apocalyptic. The rich family shut their gates for good, and the father in the farmhouse started digging holes behind his barn, saying he was preparing for the harvest. But there was nothing left to harvest. Every small argument, every lie, every unspoken fear built on top of the other, layer by layer, until each family's story became a ticking bomb. The mountain, patient and quiet, seemed to wait. The air turned colder, the nights longer. There was a feeling that something was coming, something none of them could stop, and deep down they all knew it. It wasn't madness that drove them, yet not fully. It was the weight of their own choices, pride that wouldn't bend, secrets that wouldn't stay buried, love that turned to control. Evil doesn't appear overnight. It grows quietly in the cracks of human weakness, and in the Appalachian hills, those cracks had widened beyond repair. The storm rolled through the mountains like a living thing, tearing at rooftops and bending the trees until they groaned. The rain hit the ground in thick sheets, and thunder cracked so loud it felt like the earth itself was splitting open. It was the kind of night when the roads vanished and the sky pressed down low enough to suffocate you. No one went out during storms like that, not unless they had something to hide or something they couldn't ignore. In the farmhouse on the edge of Black Hollow, the father sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle beside him. The lamp flickered, throwing shadows across his face. His son hadn't come home, not for 2 days. He'd heard talk that the boy had gone to town to stay with a friend, someone the father hated, someone he blamed for teaching his son to think for himself. Every hour that passed made the father's anger grow heavier, turning into something that hummed just beneath his skin. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the old wood, but inside, the silence was louder. When the front door creaked open, his hands tightened around the bottle until it shattered. The boy stepped inside, soaked, shivering, his eyes defiant. "I'm done living like this," he said. "I'm not you." The words hit harder than any slap. The father's jaw clenched. "You'll always be me," he growled, standing up, his boots scraping against the floor. What followed wasn't a fight, it was an eruption. Years of control, fear, and shame spilled into that room all at once. The boy shoved back this time, shouting that he wasn't afraid anymore. The father's rage broke free, his fists swinging wildly. The lamp fell, shattering glass and spreading fire across the table. Smoke rose, filling the air with the smell of burning oil and sweat. The boy reached for the door, but the father grabbed him by the collar, pulling him back into the heat. They struggled, their shadows twisting in the firelight until one final blow silenced everything. The boy crumpled, his head hitting the corner of the table with a dull crack. The father froze, his breath heavy, the fire reflecting in his glassy eyes. He didn't mean to kill him, not really, but in that moment it didn't matter. The storm outside swallowed his scream. In the mining town, the mansion was silent except for the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. The daughter stood in her room, a letter in her hand, the one her lover had left for her before he disappeared. Her father had lied. He told her the boy left town, but now she knew. The truth sat heavy in her chest, heavier than her heartbeat. Downstairs, her father poured himself a drink, staring at the fire like it owed him something. He never saw her come down the stairs. She moved like a ghost, her dress whispering against the banister. The gun was small, a family heirloom meant for display. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. He turned when he heard the click, his eyes wide, not with fear but disbelief. "You wouldn't," he said, but she did. The shot cracked through the house like thunder. He slumped back in his chair, his glass spilling red across the carpet. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the shaking, the sobbing, the whispering apologies that no one would hear. She dropped the gun and ran, barefoot, into the storm, the mud clinging to her feet as if trying to hold her down. Up on the church hill, lightning flashed across the stained glass windows, casting red and gold light over the pews. The preacher knelt before the altar, his hands trembling, his Bible open to a page soaked with rain. His wife stood behind him, her face pale, her voice steady. "It has to stop," she said. He turned, eyes wild, muttering about visions, about being chosen. "God spoke to me," he whispered. "He said sacrifice will cleanse us." But she wasn't listening anymore. She saw the knife beside him, the one he'd used on the stray animals behind the church. Her fear twisted into something colder. "You're sick," she said, and he smiled as if she'd finally understood. "No," he said softly, "I'm saved." When he lunged, she didn't scream. She grabbed the iron candlestick beside the altar and swung. The sound it made was awful, heavy, final. The preacher fell, his body collapsing against the pulpit. The rain poured harder, dripping through the cracked ceiling, washing blood into the cracks of the wooden floor. She sank to her knees beside him, whispering prayers through tears, her voice breaking on every word. And deep in the woods, where no road reached, the mother watched her sons circle one another like wolves. Something had shifted between them, too much silence, too many lies. The eldest had found what their mother had buried months ago, a torn shirt still stained, proof that their missing brother hadn't run away like she said. He confronted her, voice shaking. "What did you do?" he asked. The youngest stood behind her, eyes flicking between them, afraid to move. The mother's face was calm, too calm. "He was leaving us," she whispered. "I couldn't let that happen." The eldest stepped closer, his voice breaking. "You killed him." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of guilt, they were of fear. "I did it for you," she said. He turned to the youngest. "We have to go," he said, but she screamed then, a sound that didn't belong to a person. She grabbed the kitchen knife from the table and rushed forward. The storm outside roared as if the mountains themselves were warning her to stop, but it was too late. The blade flashed, the struggle was short, and when it ended, she stood shaking, staring down at what she'd done. The knife clattered to the floor. Her youngest son backed away, sobbing, and ran into the woods. She called after him, but the storm took her voice. Across the mountains, lightning struck again and again, lighting up each home like brief flashes of memory. Smoke rose from the farmhouse. The mansion sat in silence. The church bells rang once, just once, before stopping. In the cabin, the mother sank to her knees, her blood mixing with the mud that crept in through the door. The land itself seemed to mourn. The aftermath came with the sunrise. The storm passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural. The father in the farmhouse sat by his son's body until morning, his hands stained, his eyes empty. When the neighbors came to check on him, he said nothing, just pointed to the field and whispered. He wouldn't listen. In the town, the daughter was found by the river, her dress torn, her face cold. She never made it far. The gun was still in her hand. The preacher's wife locked the church doors from the inside and waited for the law, her voice gone from too much crying. And the mother in the woods disappeared. Only her youngest son was found days later, half-starved and wandering through the trees, saying she still called his name at night. The crimes didn't stay hidden long. The towns woke up to a morning of blood and ash, each family's secret finally brought to light. Some said the storm drove them mad. Others said the land had taken back what it was owed. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Each act was born from years of silence, pride, and fear, roots that had grown too deep to pull out. The mountains were quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that follows a scream, when everything is over, and all that's left is the echo of what you can't undo. The storm had passed, but the mountains didn't feel any lighter. The air still carried that damp, heavy smell, the scent of earth, smoke, and something else that no one wanted to name. The roads were washed out, the rivers swollen, and the valleys filled with silence. The crimes that tore through these families had left scars that couldn't be seen at first, but over the weeks that followed, the cracks spread. People whispered less and stared more. The Appalachian towns that once lived by routine, morning prayers, quiet suppers, and long Sunday walks, now moved like ghosts through their days, haunted by what they couldn't forget. In Black Hollow, the father's house became a monument of shame. When the sheriff arrived, he found the man sitting on the porch, the blood already dried on his hands. He didn't run, he didn't even look up when the cuffs were put on him. His only words were, "He should have stayed." The neighbors stood at a distance, silent and pale, unsure whether to pity him or curse him. At the trial, he didn't fight the charges. He just stared blankly at the empty seat where his son should have been. Reporters came from nearby towns to write about the madness of the mountains, and his name became another warning whispered to restless children. "Don't make your father angry." His wife, who had lived years in silence, suddenly found her voice only to lose it again. She wandered through the burned remains of their home, picking up pieces of charred wood as if rebuilding could undo what had been done. People tried to help her, offering food and comfort, but she refused, muttering that her son still talked to her in dreams. Some said she lost her mind, others said she was finally free of fear. Either way, she became another shadow among many in the valley, a woman caught between grief and madness. In the mining town, the rich family's mansion sat cold and locked behind iron gates. The father's death shocked everyone, but it was the daughter's disappearance that truly broke them. When they found her body by the river, the local papers printed her photo under the headline, "Tragedy of the Hollow Hill Heiress." The townspeople mourned her like a saint, forgetting how they once whispered about her arrogance and her family's cruelty. The story became less about what she'd done and more about what her father had made her become. At the funeral, the priest called her a victim of circumstance, but those who knew the truth felt something sharper, a sadness too complicated for pity alone. Her mother stood by the grave, her face hidden under a black veil, her hands shaking as she dropped a single white rose into the mud. She never spoke publicly again. In the church town, the bells stayed silent. The preacher's death spread quickly through the hills, but no one knew what to believe. Some said his wife killed him in self-defense, others whispered that she had fallen under some kind of curse. The sheriff's report said it was an accident, a struggle that got out of hand, but those who'd heard the preacher's last sermons doubted that. His wife never left town. She reopened the church doors weeks later, cleaned the altar herself, and prayed every morning in the same spot where he fell. People would sometimes find her talking softly to the empty pews, asking forgiveness from a God she wasn't sure was still listening. Attendance at the church dropped, and eventually no one came at all. The building stood as a reminder of faith gone wrong, a place too heavy with memory to enter. In the woods, the cabin rotted quietly. The mother's body was never found, and her youngest son became the only witness to what happened. When rescuers found him days later, half-starved and shivering, he told them that his mother was still out there, calling for them in the night. The doctors said it was trauma, that he'd imagined it, but even years later, hunters swore they heard a woman crying deep in the forest. The boy was sent away to live with distant relatives, but no one could reach him. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was in whispers, always asking the same question, "Do you hear her too?" For weeks, the stories filled newspapers and radio broadcasts. "Evil in the Appalachians," one headline read. Outsiders came with cameras and questions, turning the quiet towns into curiosities. They wanted to understand, to explain how ordinary families could turn into monsters, but those who lived there didn't have answers, only loss. The people of the mountains grew defensive, tired of being called cursed or primitive. They started locking their doors at night, started avoiding strangers, started pretending the whole thing never happened. But memory has a way of sticking to the land. The crimes didn't just destroy families, they tore apart communities. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Families who'd once shared meals now crossed the road to avoid eye contact. Children grew up hearing half-truths about what happened that stormy night, stories told in hushed voices to keep them scared and obedient. The older generation said the mountains had always been hungry, that every few decades they took their due. Whether that meant floods, famine, or blood didn't matter. The lesson was always the same: you can't hide your sins from the land. The father in prison grew thinner each year, his hands trembling as he carved small wooden crosses out of scraps. He refused visitors, saying he'd already confessed to someone greater than the courts. The preacher's wife moved to a smaller town where she lived quietly under another name. Some said she found peace, others said she never stopped hearing his voice. The surviving son from the cabin grew into a man who couldn't stay in one place for long. He moved from job to job, always leaving before winter, always afraid of storms. The daughter's mother lived her final years alone in the mansion, keeping her husband's chair untouched, as if waiting for an apology that would never come. Time moved on, but the stories stayed. The mountain roads that led to those houses grew over with vines, and the towns changed names to escape their pasts. But locals still remembered. They spoke softly about the families who crossed the line, about how pride, faith, and love can turn into poison when mixed with fear. They said evil doesn't just come from the outside, it grows from inside the heart, slowly, quietly, until it's too late to stop. Now and then, someone would claim to see lights in the woods where the cabin once stood, or hear faint bells from the abandoned church on windy nights. The mountains have their own way of keeping stories alive, not through books or monuments, but through whispers that travel with the fog. Those who live there learn not to question too much. They just know that some nights, when the mist rolls down and the air turns cold, you can feel the past pressing close. In the end, the Appalachians went back to their rhythm, slow, steady, indifferent. The crimes became part of their history, buried but never forgotten. The families were gone, but their names lingered, carved into headstones and half-burned signs. The people who remained carried the weight of it in quiet ways, a cautious kindness, a distrust of pride, a habit of locking their doors before dark. The land heals, but it never forgets. And in those mountains where the fog clings to the trees and the silence feels alive, you can still sense the echo of what happened, the guilt, the grief, and the truth that evil, once born in a home, never really dies. It just changes its face and waits for someone new to let it in. When the dust finally settled, and the last headline faded from the front pages, the story of the 10 Appalachian families was no longer just another local tragedy. It became a mirror held up to the heart of the mountains themselves. The trials were drawn out, filled with tears, confessions, and the kind of silence that hangs in a courtroom when the truth is too heavy to bear. The families who once ruled their valleys with pride now sat in shackles, their names stripped of the respect they once demanded. Some cried for forgiveness, others sat cold and unfeeling, as if the weight of what they had done still hadn't sunk in. But for most, the punishment wasn't just the sentence handed down by the judge. It was knowing that everything they once built, every legacy they'd guarded so fiercely, had turned to dust before their eyes. Neighbors who had shared meals and laughter now crossed the street to avoid each other. Churches that once filled with hymns are now filled with gossip and fear. The children who grew up playing in the woods near those cursed homes began to carry a strange sort of shame, as though their blood alone tied them to the sins of their elders. And for those who had survived, wives who had lost husbands, sons who had buried mothers, and daughters who had seen their homes burn, the pain didn't fade. It lingered like the fog that never quite left the hills, clinging to every memory and dream. Some tried to rebuild, to find forgiveness, but forgiveness is a luxury in a place where faith has been used to justify horror. The courts handed down their sentences, but justice felt incomplete. How do you measure the weight of years of fear, silence, and cruelty in prison terms? Some perpetrators were given life behind bars, others met quieter fates in their cells, their names forgotten even by those who once feared them. A few escaped conviction altogether, shielded by power, money, or the loyalty of those too afraid to speak. But even those who walked free found no peace. Their land grew barren, their homes stood empty, and their names became curses whispered to scare children into obedience. In Appalachia, the land remembers. It doesn't forgive. As time passed, the stories of those 10 families turned into lessons, then legends. Outsiders told them as ghost stories, stripping away the real horror, the humankind, and replacing it with tales of curses and hauntings. But the truth was far worse than any spirit could be. The evil that had taken root wasn't born from demons or folklore. It came from ordinary people who let hate, greed, and pride grow unchecked. It came from the hunger for control, the belief that love meant ownership, and the silence of those who chose not to intervene. That's what made the story endure, because deep down, everyone knew something like it could happen again. The media called it the fall of the Appalachian dynasties, splashing the families' names across screens and newspapers. But for the locals, it was something more personal. It was betrayal. It was proof that behind every perfect smile, every Sunday sermon, and every act of charity, something darker could hide. The region became a symbol of how easily power can corrupt, how quickly loyalty can turn into blindness, and how silence, generation after generation, can breed monsters in human skin. Scholars wrote books, psychologists studied the cases, and reporters kept digging, trying to understand how so many families in one stretch of land could fall so far. But maybe the answer wasn't hidden in psychology or law, it was in human nature itself. Because beneath all the blood and the lies, the story of these families was about more than crime. It was about what happens when people forget the difference between love and possession, faith and control, power and protection. They began with small choices, each one justified, each one necessary, or so they told themselves. But each step led them deeper into the dark until there was no turning back. And when the final acts of violence came, they weren't explosions of madness. They were the natural end to years of quiet decay. Evil, it seemed, didn't burst forth. It seeped in, slow and patient, until it became a part of everyday life. Now, decades later, the homes stand empty, overtaken by moss and vines. The laughter of children, the hum of harvest songs, the scent of dinner cooking, all gone. The only sounds that remain are the whispers carried by the wind through the hollows, where the names of those families are still spoken in half fear, half pity. People say the land feels colder there, that even animals avoid the ruins. Maybe it's superstition, or maybe it's something deeper, the echo of lives destroyed by their own hands. In the end, justice was served, but peace never came. The courts could punish the guilty, but they couldn't cleanse the history. The mountains still carry the weight of what happened, their silence a reminder of how fragile humanity can be when pride and pain go unchecked. The story of those 10 families remains a warning, a reminder that evil isn't born in monsters, but in moments when love turns into control, when faith turns into fear, and when silence allows cruelty to grow. And though the names of those families fade a little more with each passing year, the lesson they left behind still lingers in the Appalachian air. That even the purest bloodlines can rot from within when no one dares to speak the truth.